For a long time, our story becomes the story of trying to find it. And like most stories of the woods, this one must begin with the ground and with some questions to tell in which direction to look, since compasses only tell the directions, not which one to follow. To woodsmen, if you don't know the ground, you are probably wrong about nearly everything else. To woodsmen, the ground often furnishes most of the questions and a good number of the answers. And if you don't believe this, you and your story will most of the time be lost. A good woodsman, who also was a fairly good storyteller, would probably take only one good look at the crosses on the hill before the hill would be asking him, why didn't the rest of the crew, after leaving their firemen behind, follow Rumsey and Sallee to the top of the ridge instead of taking off on a side hill angle that was twice the distance the survivors needed to reach safety? Twice the distance on the ground says it doesn't make sense. And when something doesn't make sense to the ground, the mind should be left with a question. To try to keep up with Rumsey and Sallee is also to hear the ground ask questions all the time, and one in particular on which the story and 8 lawsuits depend. Are Rumsey and Sallee going straight for the top, or is Dodge's fire driving them up gulch, and so it could be the fire that prevented the side-hilling crew from below from escaping, as Thal Sr. was to charge? If Rumsey and Sallee ran alongside Dodge's fire straight to the top, another question follows: how could this escape fire burn straight up the slope and across the path of the main fire, which is being driven up gulch by a strong wind? Good question. Finally, the crevice itself, through which Rumsey and Sallee crawled to safety, forever asks its big question. What did Dieter see in me or the ground beyond that he did not like, and so did not crawl through me to safety? Without this question, the story of the Man Gulch fire would lose one of its most moving parts. Dieter was a fine jumper and a young scientist with unusual promise, yet he chose not to go through the crevice and died about 275 yards from where he left Rumsey and Sallee. When Laird and I first started investigating these questions, we assumed as almost self-evident that a few moments after the survivors crawled through the crevice, a fire must have pushed up gulch and closed it, and that for a fatal distance beyond there must have been no other opening in the reef. We had been trying to remember the reef directly above the crosses as something like a wall of China, with only one breach in it, through which the survivors escaped, and beyond that an impregnable cliff. We should have known better, but such is the power of theory over rocks that can make rocks into solid cliffs, which, however, when looked at close at hand, present openings wide enough to drive hay wagons through. On our 1977 trip to Man Gulch, Laird had discovered that only occasionally was the reef solid enough to keep a fast climber from crawling through or over it. Suddenly we felt the need for something we had needed for a long time without recognizing it: to get the 2 living survivors of the fire back into Man Gulch with us. Suddenly we also realized that we probably didn't know about a lot of things we thought we did, but maybe only dead men knew. Survivors after nearly 30 years sound unreal enough to be dead, and as far as we knew at the time, one or both of them might be. Nobody, even at the Smokejumpers base in Missoula, knew whether they were legendary but alive or just burned out flames burnished with legend. We knew, of course, that of the 3 survivors of the fire, Wag Dodge had died soon after, in 1955. But we had a hard time finding out whether Walter Rumsey and Robert Sallee had addresses on this earth. You will discover, if you ever try to find out about a mass tragedy, that people believe the few who survive die soon after it. There is always that strong mental connection between a first-class catastrophe and the kiss of death, and in the case of the Man Gulch fire, it seems there had been such a lasting kiss, since not only Dodge but the pilot, Kenneth Huber, were dead soon after the fire, as if they were also its victims. When I found that nobody at the Smokejumper base was sure whether Rumsey and Sallee were alive, I began to think of a poem by Sandburg about a little fliv of a woman who wrote a letter to God, but it went to the dead letter office, where all letters go addressed to God, and no house number. Fortunately, the basic tools of scholarship are much the same the world over. whether they're used under the ever-ready pigeons on the edge of the roof of the British Museum, or in the presence of the white mountain goats that flit among the gates of the mountains. Wherever you had better soon start looking for first-hand sources, and in order to discover what they are and where you can find them, you had better be good at bibliography. Scholars of the woods know that one of the best bibliographical reference works to consult is the postmistress of a nearby logging town. An ex-postmistress at my second home of Sallee Lake, Montana, who is a sort of yellow pages directory of the loggers of the Northwest, told me she knew of a Sallee who was related to another Sallee, and this other Sallee might be the Sallee I was looking for. If so, he was working in a sawmill west of Missoula toward Frenchtown. There's a Horner Waldorf Champion paper mill out there, and it was going full blast when I arrived. The outside, at least, looked just like the mills I had worked in when I was too young to work in a mill. I couldn't find anybody in the offices, least of all in the personnel office, where there was a sign saying, as always, that they didn't need any more help. Only one of all these offices was occupied. It said, "The nurse." So the composition of a successful sawmill must still be the same as when I was first a mill hand, and was told I would never be an honest-to-God mill hand until I lost a couple of fingers in the saws. The truth on which this ancient adage rests is that a sawmill is a large building full of moving chains, belts, and saws, all the chains and belts pulling towards saws, so if you or your clothes get caught in a chain or a belt, you know where you're going. You're going to the nurse. The composition then of a successful sawmill is a sign saying "No help wanted." All the wanted help inside the big building working close to belts and saws, and the only office occupied by one nurse who can sew on fingers. I felt encouraged. The nurse looked and sounded as if she were a French Canadian from Frenchtown. She said, "What can I do for you?" And I replied, "Do you know whether a guy by the name of Sallee ever worked here?" She asked, "Which Sallee?" If you shake all the pine trees between here and Frenchtown, maybe between here and Superior, a lot of Sallees will drop out. Either a Sallee or a Deshaw or a Lacasse. "What's the name of your Sallee?" I said, "Robert." "Isn't that funny?" she said. "I have some friends by the name of Sear who just got back from a vacation on the West Coast, and they stopped and visited Robert Sallee in Portland. If you'll wait just a moment, I'll telephone the Sears and get his address." So some lessons about the bibliography of the woods are fairly simple, such as the one about the postmistress. It's also simple if you're looking for a French Canadian in the woods. All you have to do is find another one. I flew to Portland to have a talk with Sallee, and he told me that he was sure Rumsey was alive, although he hadn't seen him in years. When he last saw Rumsey, he was in charge of some kind of soil conservation work and lived somewhere in the Southwest, but Sallee couldn't remember where, although he thought he had the address at home. The address he later sent me was not in the Southwest, but in Boise, Idaho, and a month or two later, Rumsey answered me from Lincoln, Nebraska, where he and my letter had been transferred. When first seen in person, the two survivors were unexpectedly real, and it is surprising to find that ghosts are real. They seemed big men for ghosts. Both had become very successful in their professions, and it showed. Both remained professional outdoorsmen, and that also showed. Sallee has stayed with timber in the mountains and works for Sandwell International, a consulting engineering firm. Rumsey returned to the plains from which he came and specialized in irrigation and soil conservation. He was to be killed in an airplane crash in 1981. It didn't take long after meeting him to discover they depended upon being curious. Among other things, they were curious about me. They couldn't quite figure what I was up to and what my game was. It took a winter of letter writing to make myself seem real to them and on the up and up. But it worked both ways. Laird and I were curious about them, as you would have been. I wanted to see them in the crack of the earth through which they had crossed from death. Since both of them had told me they had spent much of their afterlife trying to forget the fire that they alone could remember. I also became interested in seeing what they did and didn't remember. I thought, just as an intellectual exercise, it would be interesting to observe what real ghosts remember of the death they did not die, but those only seconds behind them did. And of course, it would be moving to see two real ghosts together again, who had been roommates in the first life and so had helped each other a second life. I was not surprised to find that my chances of getting them back into Man Gulch depended upon their being curious about the same things I was, which they were. Out of curiosity, then, all four of us agreed to spend the day of July 1st, 1978, in Man Gulch. The shortest possible version of the long story of finally getting together in Man Gulch is that finally we did. Even the shortened version should include the details that Laird's boat wouldn't work after he had dragged it over the Continental Divide from Missoula to Helena the evening before. But he remembered a hunting pal who lived 29 miles out of Helena on the Missouri River and had a jet propulsion boat, the kind that could be landed in shallow water, and you can bet there are no docks where we were going to land. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Laird returned to Helena with the borrowed boat. We gave him a couple of hours in bed before pushing the boat into the Missouri and headed for the gates of the mountains. We landed the big boat at the mouth of Rescue Gulch, which must be among the Earth's special gulches to Rumsey and Sallee. When they crawled through the reef out of Man Gulch, they crossed into Rescue Gulch, and it is near the head of Rescue Gulch that they found the rock slide, in which they dodged from one side to the other as the main fire flipped by them. It is ahead of this gulch that Hellman reached after the fire caught him crossing out of Man Gulch, and it is up this gulch that Jansen and Sallee led the rescue crew the night of the fire and met Rumsey coming down trying to reach the Missouri at midnight for a canteen of water for Hellman. Approaching Man Gulch from Rescue Gulch is approaching Man Gulch from the side, and Man Gulch can't be seen until you look down into it after reaching the top of the ridge. However, if you know where to look, from the mouth of Rescue Gulch, you can see Hellman's Cross close to the top. It's up this gulch that Jansen took Gisborne and Jansen, having been the head of the rescue crew, knew where Hellman's Cross was, and from the mouth of Rescue Gulch pointed it out to Gisborne, who took 2 hours getting there, stopping every 100 yards by prior agreement. Probably it was because Gisborne died of a heart attack on the way out that the others with me insisted I not try to make the climb, being 20 years older than Gisborne was when he died, and like him, having had heart problems. They even said they had been told in Missoula not to let me go. Finally, I had to get personal with and tell them, look, there's a mountain downriver no further than 12 miles from here by air, and that also looks over the Missouri. It was named by my wife when she was still a girl, and she named it Mount Jessie after herself, although she lived an otherwise modest life. At her request, her ashes are there now. Nobody should feel bad if I should remain behind on one of these hills that looks her way. So Lee reached over and took my pack off my shoulders, and we started climbing. He and Rumsey walked ahead toward the top of the hill. They seemed to get bigger instead of smaller as they climbed. Sallee, who at 17 had been underage for the Smokejumpers, remained almost oversized. The afternoon I talked with him in Portland, in the boardroom of Sandwell International. He looked big just sitting there. He answered questions suddenly, especially if he didn't like them. Almost as soon as we sat down, I asked, is it true you lied about your age to get into the Smokejumpers? He never moved from his elbow. Who told you that? He asked. When I said somebody from Frenchtown, he said yes. Not long afterwards, I asked him how he accounted for the fact that he and Rumsey, the two youngest, the most inexperienced members of the crew, were the only ones to survive. This brought him off his elbows. What do you mean the most inexperienced? What difference does it make that we were in our first year as Smokejumpers? Jumping had nothing to do with what happened in Man Gulch. Man Gulch was nothing but a foot race with a fire. I was brought up in the backwoods in northern Idaho where I had to go 4 miles each way to school, and I ran it. I was the best walker in every crew I worked on, and I made a point of showing I was because it showed I wasn't underage. Rumsey was from the plains and from a small town, and he was tough. We were roommates, and if things didn't go right, we saw that we never got far apart. Probably one reason Sallee has done so well in business is that he doesn't fool around with questions. He himself attributed his position at Sandwell to his absolutely white hair. Probably both reasons are about the same. Rumsey was a lanky Kansan and liked to have time to think and to remain in doubt about quite a few things, partly because as a Kansan he found it uneconomical, even dangerous to think of too many things at once. He was the one who thought only of the top of the ridge. Walking behind, Laird and I could see the two in the same picture frame, and high above in the same picture, the cross of Hellman. We should like to have had a photograph of the two climbing toward the cross, but the cross was too far away to have shown. Only in our memories are all three in the same frame, two returning and one forever there. We kept wondering what they were talking about, although we made a point of staying far enough behind so we could not hear. Then they stopped and waited for us to catch up. Sallee said, "Hellman's cross is not in the right place." Rumsey said, "I agree." The cross was still half a mile above, and the grass everywhere was a foot or more high. I said, "We're lucky we can see the cross from here," but I didn't argue. It was Rumsey who had started down Rescue Gulch at midnight to get water from the Missouri for Hellman, and it was Sallee whom he had met halfway up leading Jansen and the doctors and the rescue crew. The two together had had no trouble finding Hellman in the land which in the dark had lost its identity. 29 years later, they were going to give themselves a test to determine whether, unlike most mortals, they could find their way in this world, and the world had died behind them. Sallee said, "The cross is too close to the rock slide where the fire went around us." He said to Rumsey, "Remember, we yelled after the fire went by, and Hellman answered about 30 yards away." Rumsey said, "I don't think his cross is even on the right side of that draw." Sallee said, "I'm positive," a word combination he likes. "On our way back this afternoon, let's go by the rock slide and check." Later that afternoon, when we came back and were looking down toward the cross, but were still quite away from it, Rumsey said, "I think we are right. It should be further from the rock slide on the other side of the draw and lower down." His answer came from below. Sallee said, "I know positively it's wrong. There was a big flat rock lower down on the other side of the draw, and we put him on it to keep his burns out of the ashes. That's it," they said when they got close to the flat rock. "His cross should be there." Sallee said to Rumsey, "We could be doubly positive if we could find the tin can Dodge left you when he and I started for the river and help. Remember, he said he left you a can of Irish white potatoes in his canteen. He had thrown everything else away." Rumsey looked behind him and said, as a Methodist, "By gosh, there's a rusty old can." I started to reach for it, but Rumsey stopped me. "Don't touch it. Let me think for a minute." Then he said, "Of course, I didn't have a can opener with me, only my jackknife. Besides, Hellman didn't want the potatoes, just the juice. Even though it was salty, it would make him more thirsty, so I jabbed my knife twice into the opposite sides of the top of the can, one of them to let in the air for the juice to come out, the other one." Then Sallee reached down and handed Rumsey the rusty can, and it had two knife jabs on opposite sides of its top. They had passed their own test. So Hellman's cross is not properly placed, as two ghosts who are woodsmen could tell a half a mile away. It should be over 30 yards to the west of the rock slide, across a draw, lower down the hill, and next to a big flat rock. The night before in Helena, while Laird was down on the Missouri somewhere trying to find a very special kind of friend who owned a special kind of boat with a motor that worked, Rumsey, Sallee, and I sat several hours around the dining table before carrying out the dishes. We were sure that tomorrow there would be 4 men in Man Gulch who collectively knew more about its tragedy than would ever be assembled there again. 2 were the only living survivors, both of them still outdoorsmen. Another was one of the Smokejumpers' finest modern foremen, who had become information officer at the Smokejumper base in Missoula. Another, answering all questions the public could think of asking about getting to a fire and back again. And I had been on some big fires too, and if that was before the other 3 were born and made me a little slow of foot, I compensated by having collected the best existing file of documents on Man Gulch, including statements Rumsey and Sallee had made soon after the fire, which I intended to carry in a pack sack with me into Man Gulch the next day. When we convened as a complete court upon ourselves, plaintiffs, defendants, witnesses, attorneys, judges, and jurors, in such distinguished company, including the pack sack, it would be hard for any one of us to remain far wrong, at least not for long. Since it takes a lot of daytime just to get in and out of Man Gulch, we were selecting our targets in advance so we wouldn't end up tomorrow as scattered over Man Gulch as the cargo had been after it was dropped from the plane. Inevitably, our sights all lined up on the same target, the scene of the catastrophe and the crosses. You would have picked the place of the crosses yourself. Nearly everyone would, so ancient and binding are the connections between drama, religion, and the top of a hill. The Christian scene of suffering, where hill meets sky, has painted so many thousands of times that something within it must direct it to paint itself. On page 10 and 11 of the photo gallery in this book is a photograph in which much of what was left of the catastrophe of Man Gulch appears in quiet composition, but is short of being classic in the composition of a catastrophe. I found it in a Forest Service file, and so for a moment felt that nature had composed it, only later realizing that it is the work of a partly informed photographer with a good enough eye to combine the standard principles of photographic design with much of the ground in which the historical and dramatic catastrophe happened. But it is short of a perfect combination of art and history, because an error in photographic art seriously divests it of intensity of the real thing. And what is more, it omits a slice of adjoining ground which would not have been hard to include, and on which two of the most important events in the tragic story occurred. Still, it is the best of the historical photographs of the scene of suffering I had found, so it was the photograph Laird and I had to work with as we started our quest for the missing parts, and you too should start with it. Despite its faults, this composition of the scene effectively observes the traditional three-part division of foreground, middle distance, and something at the top to frame it. Each of these topographical and aesthetic formations making visible a separate dramatic and historical part of the tragedy, with each given its proper size. The foreground is the darkened land of death extending completely across the bottom of the picture. Dead trees, burned, fallen, and rotten. A broken stub of one of the fallen trees standing close to and as high as the cross to expose its death. A thistle, the only thing living, fronts the white cross of Stanley Reba, which is the lowest on the hill of all the crosses, and which possesses all the rest of the photograph and says what the rest is all about. Topographically, historically, and dramatically, the end of this tragedy properly rests upon this dark foreground. The upper frame of the tragedy is also composed of topography, history, and drama. The reef of rocks at the top is probably salvation if it could be reached. Near the top is the highest standing tree on the slope, marked X on the photograph. It comes out of the middle distance, but its top connects visually with the reef and even the sky suggestively. Just to the left of an opening in the reef might be the crevice with a juniper bush on the other side. Likewise, the dead tree might be the tree Dodge stood beside when he lit his escape fire. Above the frame is one faint semi-arid cloud, perhaps a reminder that Smokejumpers sooner or later return to the sky from where they were dropped, certainly a sign that rain will not come for days. The seemingly anonymous middle distance between Reba's Cross and the reef is where nearly all the tragedy occurred. Anonymous since no one who lived saw what finally happened there. Anonymous also since even those who died there didn't see much of what was happening to them, because at the very end there was only heat too hot to breathe and not enough oxygen to keep the brain alive. A photographic mistake, however, obscures one cause of the fatality of this middle distance: the steepness of the slope. Between the foreground and the reef, it's about a 76% slope, meaning that for every 10 feet you walk forward, you gain 7.6 feet in elevation, climbing at about 45-degree angle. But in the photograph, instead of the middle distance rearing up like half a cliff, it looks more like a gentle grassy slope of Custer Hill. If the photographer had had the right equipment with him, he could still have featured Reba's Cross in the foreground without flattening the scene of suffering behind it. The more the photograph erroneously reduces the grade of that slope, the more it erroneously reduces the actual speed and intensity of the fire that went up it, and even the length of its flame. The more it erroneously flattens the scene, the more it eliminates the emotional realization of young men that it will be impossible for them to climb the slope as fast as fire. Since the four of us at one time or another had worked on mapping crews, we knew that to trace the movement of men or fire precisely, we had to start as we would in mapping the course of a stream, at a point already located with certainty on the ground and map. To begin, we would try to find a nearby location point established by an outfit which always seemed to know where it was in the woods, the United States Geological Survey. The location point usually would be a lead plug driven into the ground at the top of a prominent peak and stamped with USGS on the elevation. Then, after we had compassed and paced the drainage system from there, we would continue our line until we could connect with another established location point. Unless we began and ended with known points, we might have accurately traced all the bends in a stream, but how in the hell did we know where the stream was? We agreed without argument that we needed to locate two key points on the hillside to map the final movements of those who died there. For sentimental and theological reasons alone, the first point had to be the opening in the reef through which Rumsey and Sallee crossed out of Man Gulch. Late in the afternoon of August 5th, 1949, it was the opening to salvation. Now it was the point, like magnetic north, that had beckoned the two survivors back to Man Gulch. Their primary reason to return to the scene of the fire was to pass through the crevice again. Second, and most important of all, was to locate accurately the spot where Dodge had set his fire. A missing part of the story, threatening to remain forever missing, was the tragic ending itself. Whatever it was that happened after Dodge's men passed this spot, no one lived who saw this missing part, and a storyteller who wanted to find it would have to know that the missing part of his story pivoted about a single point. There couldn't even be the cartography of a story without an accurate location of the spot where the escape fire started. It may seem not worth mentioning again now, but the rest of this sentence is placed here with some care. Dodge said that from his fire to where he found Silva, still alive, was about 150 to 200 feet east, up gulch, and about 100 feet below him. Also, I had a high priority of my own. The cross of Henry Thal, Jr., who was the cross farthest up gulch and closest to the top of the ridge, his cross would define an important outer boundary of the tragedy. In addition to its being useful to the cartography of the tragedy, there was this personal reason. I find in trying to record the tragedy of a good many characters who were young and much alike that a few remained distant from me and anonymous and were always dead. Only some came close to me and asked me to visit their crosses when I returned to Man Gulch and to try to be of some comfort to them. Thal's cross was one I always visited, and when I did, I would try to imagine a little of what it must have been like to be the highest on the hill and not quite high enough. I also wished I could have been of some comfort to his father, but he was so enraged in his grief I probably couldn't have been, even if I had had the chance. Yet, even if Thal had to die, his father should have found room to be proud of where his son is, the nearest to the top. When all this is added up, it comes close to a day's work in Man Gulch, given the amount of energy it takes just to move around in Man Gulch after getting there. But in addition, Laird and I had a piece of unfinished business we hoped to wind up on this trip. Although we hadn't mentioned it to Rumsey and Sallee for fear of suggesting what we wanted them to say, we still had only a guess for an answer to the question that had first sent us on our quest to find the two survivors and persuade them to come back to Man Gulch with us. Why didn't the rest of the crew, only a few moments behind you, follow you straight up the top of the ridge in safety? Despite a long after-dinner discussion, it wasn't possible to think of everything, but we felt we had a fairly good plan. We couldn't tell what part of it we would be starting with since we planned to approach Man Gulch by way of Rescue Gulch, and so would have to guess just where we would come out on top of the ridge. There was no question, though, that there was just one place of all the places that Rumsey and Sallee wanted to see first, when they reached the top and looked down, the opening in the reef through which they had crawled out of Man Gulch. We all hoped that when we came to the top, we would be close to it. Near the top of the ridge, we ran into a deep game trail, side-hilling toward what would probably be an open, wide saddle. We followed it because the footing was good, not because we were looking for an open, wide saddle. Even before we reached it, Sallee said, "It's the same goddamn pass the Forest Service investigator tried to make me believe was where Rumsey and I crawled out of Man Gulch." Over a quarter of a century later, Sallee was still angry because some company detective had tried to make him believe that he didn't know where he was at the big moment in his life. French Canadians don't take kindly to being told they don't know where they are in the woods. Sallee said he wouldn't even stop for a few minutes to let me go up the ridge and show him the right crossing. The investigator's pass was certainly a low and wide one. The top of the reef had decomposed and completely disappeared for 30 or 40 yards. "It's a good-looking pass," I told him. "A couple of threshing outfits could cross here abreast." "That's one of the big troubles with it," Sallee said. "Rumsey and I had to squeeze through a crevice in the reef one at a time." I knew without looking at the documents in my pack sack, which Sallee still carried, that it had been a close squeeze at the top for the survivors. Both of them early had testified that they first saw the top of the ridge as they approached Dodge lighting his fire. Rumsey stated that when they left Dodge, they followed the up-gulch side of Dodge's fire until they spotted on their right a pile of rocks at the crest and headed for it. They have always agreed that Sallee was the first to edge through the crevice and Dieter did not follow. I asked Sallee, "Why didn't you go straight uphill from Dodge's fire to this wide pass instead of angling up gulch under a reef that might not have another opening for a long way?" He answered, "Because by then there was fire in this pass." So there, at long last, was the answer to one of the questions that the survivors alone could give. In their testimony, they had sometimes insisted that, after leaving Dodge at his fire, they had gone straight for the top, and at other times seemed less sure. Their answer is that they would like to have gone straight for the top, and did for a way, but a fire on the top of the ridge had closed a wide saddle above them, forced them to angle to their right to the next opening, up gulch in the rocks above them. The sight of fire or smoke at the top of the ridge may also explain why Dieter turned aside at the crevice, and why most of the crew kept angling up gulch. But Sallee's answer raises a new question. What fire was it anyway that was running up gulch on top of the ridge, cutting off escape from below? Was it a branch of the main fire that had been chasing them up the gulch, or was it their foreman's escape fire turning up gulch after reaching the top of the ridge? We didn't sit down to rest from the climb. We just kept following Sallee up gulch on the ridge looking for the crevice. For one thing, it was too cool in the winds up there to sit in one's perspiration. Although it was the 1st of July in the middle of the morning, the world of high altitudes is hard to believe from below. It is never what flat country people called normal. That first summer I tried to reach Man Gulch, a cloudburst turned our perspiration to ice and ended my brother-in-law's friendly visits to Man Gulch with a case of pneumonia. Most of the times I've been there, though, it's been so hot in the day that rattlesnakes stay in the shade of their holes, although even then the cool is never far away. The heat of the mountains is not the heat of the plains, which stay hot all night. Remember on the day of the fire, it had been a record 97 degrees in Helena in the shade, and it had to have been a lot hotter than that in the burning gulch. But the night of the fire, it had been so cool near where we were standing that the rescue crew had given Hellman their one blanket and had huddled close to Silva to keep him warm. As we climbed up from the river, we soon left summer behind and were walking through the world of spring flowers, beautiful blues and yellows, lupines and vetches, and balsam roots looking with wide brown eyes at ghosts and intruders. But it became even cooler toward the end of the day, so we never sat down, tired as we were, until we got back to the boat and water level. It took Sallee and Rumsey only a few minutes to announce their crevice. Within 20 or 25 yards up gulch from the open pass, the reef appears again. For 50 yards or so is a solid cliff. And then there is a crevice. The two survivors took turns crawling through it, trying it on for size, as it were, and seeming to find that the passing years had shrunken it and made it a tighter fit. I suppose they were amusing because of the difficulty they were having fitting through the crevice, but it was not possible to watch them without mixed feelings. For me, it was hard to look at the crevice and not think of Dieter turning away from it. It must have been even harder for Laird. He came over to where I was standing and finally said, "I wouldn't have gone through there either. You couldn't tell from here, especially in the smoke, whether you would only be walking into a fire trap on the other side." "In the smoke," I said, "nothing could have looked sure." "I would have gone with Dieter," he said. There was no more to that conversation. Where could it go? When it came Rumsey's turn to crawl through the crevice, I followed him. Then we went looking for the juniper bush he had fallen into. So tired he'd almost let matters rest there. That's it, he said. "I was exhausted. I almost stayed there. But when we got closer, he began to shake his head until words finally came out of it. I just can't believe it. I just can't believe I've been wrong all these years. It isn't a juniper bush. It's a dwarf, distorted alpine pine." After a while, he repeated, "I just can't believe it. You just can't believe anything that happens in a forest fire." He didn't realize at the moment what a great amount of truth he had uttered, especially about the juniper bush. A day is an inadequate piece of time in which to get anything done in rough country, so we had split the job of locating the two remaining points of the triangle, where Dodge had lit his escape fire and where Thal had fallen. Naturally, Rumsey and Sallee, who had seen Dodge light his fire, wanted the job of finding where they had cut loose for the top, and Laird went with them, having himself made the escape fire something of his specialty. At the time, I was glad to have the assignment of visiting Thal's cross, and on the way of passing Dieter's. There are moments of the fire that I have tried to live through again and again with Thal and Dieter, especially the moment when they came nearest to escaping, but realized that they were not going to make it. To Thal's father, the retired ranger, his boy was always a boy. When someone on the board of review testified the crew consisted of highly experienced firefighters, his grief and anger again swirled up out of his son's ashes. "My boy spent 2 years in the Condon Ranger District on fire guard. I knew him well. This I say of my own boy. He was a long way from an experienced firefighter. He could barely handle tools. He could handle tools well, but as being productive in handling tools, well, he was not, and most of those boys pretty much the same. This outcry is even more, but not the veterans. This outcry is even more confused than its sentence structure. The young members of the crew couldn't have been old-time experts with tools, but they had to be plenty good with their few basic tools of firefighting, and the son of a ranger had to be damn good. Anyway, what did fire tools have to do with the fate of the crew in Man Gulch? They died in fire, but had no chance to fight it. All the crew did with their tools was throw them away on orders from their foreman. The history of the Man Gulch fire is the report of a race with the fire to death. In this race, the cross nearly as close to the top of the hill as Thal's is Navone's, and Navone was 28. He had been a paratrooper for 5 years and a lieutenant at Bastogne. What do you expect of your 19-year-old son, who had only 8 jumps on a fire to his credit, but was even a little closer to the top than Navone? The crosses are simple and impressive, and were made by the Smokejumpers in Missoula. As a photograph of Reba's cross shows, they are concrete with the name on a horizontal bronze plate. That's all there is, and that leaves everything very lonely up there, where no one goes walking or visiting. Besides rattlesnakes, there are mountain sheep and mountain goats, which also appear lonely, and as the photograph shows, the fire left few living trees standing, so there is not even the friendship of shade. Actually, I had come to Thal's Cross to do 2 jobs. Besides locating Thal's Cross accurately, I was to inspect the condition of his cross and that of several others nearby. Laird and I promised Edward Heelman, Director of Aviation and Fire Management, that while in Man Gulch we would inspect all the crosses to let him know if they needed repairing or replacing. To be sure that promise was kept, the four of us on the hill on July 1st, 1978, had divided the crosses among us. Thall's Cross is straight underneath an open saddle on the ridge where the surface of the reef had decomposed, so the reef did not act as a barrier to prevent him from reaching the top of the ridge. It is impossible to say exactly how close Thall's Cross is to the top, because without instruments it is impossible to locate the crest on the wide, smooth surface of the ridge. We had recently found a 1952 Forest Service contour map of, quote, part of Man Gulch fire area, end of quote. See pages 8 and 9 of the photo gallery, where the distance from Thall's Cross to the top of the ridge is probably less than 100 yards. By the same map, it is 140 yards from his cross to Dieter's. The distance from his cross to the place where Dodge started his fire will vary according to where you think Dodge lit his gopher match. If you accept the two places as correctly located on the 1952 contour map, the distance is 390 yards. It's not that certain that Thall's Cross marks precisely where Thall fell. I found his Forest Service flashlight with the battery still in it 7 or 8 yards above his cross. And many of the crosses must be downhill from where the bodies fell. On that 76% slope of crumbled cliff and dry, slick grass, it's difficult just to crawl without slipping. Those running and stumbling, exhausted and terrified, may have rolled downhill after they fell. Remember that Jansen had another theory even more terrifying, noting that all the remaining non-flammable objects, such as watches and wallets, were found uphill from the bodies, unless under a fallen body. He theorized that the power of the fire was so great it carried these objects with it. Both theories are probably correct. On my way back from Thall's Cross, I stopped to check on the condition of the crosses near his, all the time keeping an eye on the survivors who were supposed to be locating the spot where Dodge lit his fire. At a distance they seemed stylized, as if they had been assigned to a repetitive one-act play with 3 repetitive movements. They climbed back up the hill to the crevice, gestured toward there to the sky with seemingly no accompanying words and no response from the sky, and then retired downhill to gesture again. They're seemingly just to themselves. Such vast country that swallows up words also makes gestures seem very small. It makes humans themselves small, 2 and 3 foot miniatures. At a distance they were animated gestures that had found a script in the rocks and were repeating it until they could get it right. The identity of the animations could be told only from the gestures. The biggest gestures were Sallee, being French. Rumsey was the Methodist gesture with one hand raised to the sky. You could guess what the gestures meant by seeing where Laird went afterwards. When I noticed that, when the gestures and the accompaniment returned downhill, they did not always return to the same place. That was the tip-off. Maybe there was an argument going on between Sallee and Rumsey about where Dodge had lit his fire. It certainly wasn't what it was like at the crevice, through which they had crawled back and forth with difficulty but in complete agreement. And sure enough, they were arguing about where they had left their foreman behind. But as the words paralleling their gestures became recognizable, it became clear they shared basic agreements. Most important was their certainty that they had located the opening in the reef through which they had edged their way to safety. In the coming conversation, note how the crevice is the North Star that guides all arguments and tells the directions of all movements and measures their distances. The second basic agreement was their certainty that a Forest Service map prepared a month after the fire, quote, Helena National Forest, Man Gulch Fire, number 35, August 5, 1949, first progress map, end of quote, incorrectly locates the origin of Dodge's fire, a certainty essentially derived from their first one. The map's location of Dodge's fire isn't compatible with the location of the crevice. I long had some misgivings about map number 35 because it had been prepared immediately after the fire, so I had gone in search of another and had found the 1952 contour map, which I had come increasingly to respect. I should add here that on the 1952 contour map, the origin of the escape fire is located close to where it is on map number 35. I joined the circle of gestures, just as Sallee was saying, quote, the map places it too far back toward the mouth of the gulch. If that's where Dodge lay down in his escape fire, then I wouldn't have seen him entering his fire or the crew angling up the hillside after passing him. There's a lateral finger ridge here that would have been between us and would have blocked my view from the crevice. Sallee's argument will be easier to follow if visualized on the photograph of Reba's Cross. Sallee had just decided that the origin of Dodge's fire was at the base of the highest dead standing tree, marked X, between Reba's Cross and the reef, so close to the reef, in fact, that it is only 60 or 70 yards below it. Their crevice, they had decided almost immediately, is an opening in the reef just slightly to the right of the top of this highest tree. Remember, Sallee has always been positive that coming out of the timber he looked ahead and saw Dodge lighting his fire near a lone standing tree. In this photograph, then, it is almost as straight as a ruler from Reba's Cross to the two most important points we were trying to locate. First, from Reba's Cross to the origin of Dodge's fire is located by Sallee, and second, from there to the crevice both Sallee and Rumsey had just crawled through. Sallee accordingly is repudiating both map number 35 and the 1952 contour map which located Dodge's fire outside the photograph, slightly farther down gulch than Reba's Cross. It makes a distinct, dramatic difference to this photograph whether Sallee or the maps are right. If Sallee is right, then his photograph shows the whole final tragic scene, both where the final tragic decisions were made at Dodge's fire and the adjoining field of final suffering. If, however, the maps are correct in locating the origin of the foreman's fire outside the upper left corner of this photograph, then this photograph takes us in most of the field of suffering, but not the point where the big decisions were made. To follow Sallee's argument against the location of the origin of Dodge's fire on the maps, we must focus on the lateral ridges running almost at right angles from the reef. These elevations have been formed by the dry gulches running on each side of them, and though these lateral ridges have water in them, usually only in the spring, millennia of springs have cut them deep, a lot deeper than is suggested by this photograph. Sallee is correct that one of these lateral ridges, seen in the upper left corner of the photograph, would have cut off the view from his crevice to where the maps locate the origin of Dodge's fire. Clearly, to Sallee, the number one condition a map of the Man Gulch fire must meet is that the origin of the escape fire can be seen from where he took his last look at Man Gulch, a cartographic condition to be respected by anyone who has learned from the Bible to respect the last look behind. Besides, said Rumsey, the map's location of the origin of Dodge's fire makes where we started just too far from the crevice. We never could have made it to the reef if we had to go that far. What's more, Sallee added, it was beside a tree. I remember Dodge was stooped over near a tree, starting a fire with a cigarette lighter. It was a gopher match, I said, because I had put myself to some trouble to find out what a gopher match is. A paper match pulled from a matchbook. They were so unreliable that a firefighter trying to light a backfire with one would usually have to go for a second match. I don't remember a tree at all, Rumsey said. How could you forget, Sallee said. There it is, still standing. And he pointed at the dead tree in the photograph that is nearest the top of the ridge. Rumsey, with the composure of Kansas, repeated, Dodge wasn't standing near a tree. On the hill, the base of the highest standing tree is in a much deeper depression than it appears to be in the photograph. And Rumsey believed that Dodge lit his fire not in a depression behind a finger ridge, but near its crest, and even closer to the reef than Sallee places it. So that is how matters stood, even after we called it a day and started back for the river. The difference between the two of them does not appear to be great, only 40 or 50 yards, but it could be important. It was on our way back to the river that we stopped at the rock slide, whereupon they collaborated in relocating the site of Hellman's Cross. It was a brilliant job, and Plato, who talks as if all knowledge depends upon memory, would have been pleased to see them performing this cartographic feat of relocating Hellman's Cross by remembering a flat rock and a tin can with 2 holes in the top of it. At the mouth of the gulch, a strange boat and 2 strange men were waiting for us. The men became more familiar as we got closer and soon agreed to help us drink the beer we had brought along to save ourselves from dehydration. They turned out to be the boatmen who conducted tours through the gates of the mountains, and a friend of his whom he had brought along to see the 2 living survivors of Man Gulch fire in the flesh. The standard tourist excursion starts at Hilger Landing and goes as far downriver as the mouth of Man Gulch, where the tourists get a lecture on the Man Gulch fire. The man who gives the lecture had come all the way downriver and had waited for us at the mouth of Man Gulch in order to see his lecture alive. He had his friend pose Rumsey and Sallee for various photographs and was careful to include nothing that was not in his lecture, particularly not Laird or me. With an arm around each other and a can of beer in the hand that was free, the survivors didn't look as much like ghosts as they had when they went up the hill. But at water level they were still impressive, and I was still full of wonder. Among other things, I kept wondering if some of the big things we had done on the hill were wrong, even if they had been done by the best 4 men in the business.